In our last video, we explored the lighting concept known as chiaroscuro, from the 15th century Renaissance up to the German Expressionist film movement of the 1920s. In this video, we're going to explore several examples of this lighting technique across each of the main Star Wars films, so that we can reveal the fascinating role that chiaroscuro has played throughout the Skywalker Saga. If you haven't already, consider checking out the previous videos in this series to get acquainted with some of the concepts that I'll be mentioning in this video. Links to those are in the description below. Let's begin by examining the general lighting template used for A New Hope. It's been mentioned that a lot of the lighting for this film was constrained by its production design. In discussing the film's visual style, cinematographer Gilbert Taylor revealed that art director John Barry's sets, particularly the Death Star, were like a coal mine. They were all black and gray, with really no opportunities for lighting at all. Taylor opted to flood these stages with panel lighting, essentially giving George the freedom to shoot at any angle without the need to adjust for shadows. This predominant high-key lighting style for the spaceship interiors was then paired with a more naturalist lighting approach for Tatooine and Yavin 4, thus setting the mold for future Star Wars films. With A New Hope, the lighting primarily enhances the film's sense of realism and naturalism, aiding the film's mission to create an immaculate sci-fi reality. However, there are two notable moments of chiaroscuro in this film that harken back to the German Expressionist concept of stimming, or mood. The first occurs on the Jawa sandcrawler near the beginning of the film, where the darkened interior reflects the morbid reality of the Jawa's choice of trade. The other notable example occurs during the trash compactor scene, where the sense of danger is amplified by its interior dim red lighting. Though beyond these scenes, we really need to examine the next films in this trilogy to get a better sense of chiaroscuro's impact across the saga. With The Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars' production design went from a lighting impediment to its own source of experimentation. In particular, several scenes throughout the film utilize chiaroscuro to capture a character's psychological state of mind. The most obvious, perhaps, is the scene where Luke meets his Jungian shadow self within the cave on Dagobah. Here, the shading creates an abstract vision of Luke's unconscious mind, where a dark version of himself who relies on violence and aggression lies in wait for him. While this is a classic example of chiaroscuro's ability to enhance a character's state of mind, my favorite example from this film occurs a bit later, when Luke prepares to leave for Cloud City. The waning hope that Yoda has in his new pupil is perfectly captured in the fading spotlight that hangs over him. Then, there's a reprieve of darkness, followed by the red glow of the X-Wing's thrusters, foreshadowing the certain peril that Luke is heading towards. Even the brief flash of white light at the end mirrors Yoda's sentiment that there is another hope for the galaxy in Luke's sister. This of course all leads to the lightsaber duel between Luke and Darth Vader. This sequence in particular takes full advantage of the set design's potential for lighting, creating eerie passageways, dark corridors, and villainous silhouettes throughout. Here, you can really feel that concept of stimming, the vibrations of the soul which the German Expressionists were known to evoke in their own films. With Empire, there's a particular succinctness about its use of chiaroscuro. It's never overdone, but with Return of the Jedi, this technique is arguably used to an even greater extent, and with much more kinship with the German Expressionists. For instance, the unusual architecture of Jabba's palace, which itself recalls the sets found in German Expressionist films like Der Golem or Waxworks, is layered in this metaphysical mood of hazy and unnatural light. Another nod to German Expressionism comes from the spotlighting on Han's carbonized body, which perhaps pointedly evokes Cesare's first awakening in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Luke's silhouetted form as he enters the palace is another noteworthy example, though the entire palace sequence is just brimming with these moments of otherworldly light. The most poignant example, perhaps within the whole trilogy, takes place midway through the film. As Yoda passes on, the weak flicker of firelight captures the fragility that's inherent to all life. Watching the flame go out just before Luke talks with Obi-Wan's Force Ghost further highlights that solemn finality in his master's death. As you move toward the end of the film, Luke's Jungian shadow makes a return as Darth Vader threatens his sister in the Emperor's throne room. That hateful aggression spills out into a duel between father and son, which of course gives way to the well-lit triumph of spirit that Luke has in the face of the Emperor's machinations. Also interesting is the lighting used on the Emperor's face throughout much of this scene. It's quite reminiscent of the peculiar chiaroscuro utilized on the original 1932 version of The Mummy, which itself was directed by German Expressionist cinematographer Karl Freund. Taken together, we can see a pattern of growing complexity in the use of light and shade throughout this original trilogy. However, with George back at the helm for the prequels and the digital era of film coming into full swing, the visual template for the next trilogy returns to a more naturalist sensibility. In regards to the Phantom Menace's cinematography, DP David Tattersall has said that George and I always came back to the idea that the feeling of Phantom, especially in the scenes set on Tatooine, should be very much the same as what we've seen before. On sets where the blue screens were such a large portion of the frame, light balancing became more difficult. Naturalism was always the aim, and so we sought to keep the light as soft as possible. For this reason, the lighting on the Phantom Menace plays out much like A New Hope's, striking a balance between high-key and naturalist lighting techniques. There's a handful of shots where shading overcomes the dominance of light within the film, but like Da Vinci, it's all very much in the service of realism and naturalism. Attack of the Clones, on the other hand, is a different matter entirely. Across the saga, this film's narrative was the most inspired by the film noir genre of the 1940s, which itself was influenced by the German Expressionists. Yet, despite this being the case, it's not the direct nods to film noir that make the chiaroscuro of this film stand out. In particular, there are 3 moments of expressive chiaroscuro I want to point out, which I think make this film one of the most interesting use cases throughout the entire series. Each example centers on the growing romantic tension of Anakin and Padme throughout the film. So the first comes when Padme admits her secret feelings for Anakin on Naboo. The overwhelming shading here almost feels fashioned after the tenebrism of Caravaggio, reflecting Padme's internal struggle over the taboo nature of the duo's mutual attraction. Later in the film, this growing intimacy is then marked by an embrace on Tatooine. This is arguably the first time in Star Wars where the lighting and camera work fully embrace its own abstract depiction. Much like how the shadowy figure of Count Orlok was a pure abstraction of horror in Murnau's Nosferatu, the shadow of Anakin and Padme's embrace acts as an abstract expression of their secret affections. The third example comes right after Padme gives in to her true love for Anakin on Geonosis. With Padme's feelings fully out of the shadows, we're shown a silhouette of their embrace as the two enter the light of the arena. This triptych of scenes is a really unique way to showcase this forbidden love, and it's easily the most interesting case throughout the entire saga. Finally, there's Revenge of the Sith, where a significant number of scenes takes place at sunset or at night. This makes the final film in this trilogy much darker than the previous 2 outings. The lighting also heavily leans into symbolism, reflecting the twilight of Anakin's soul, as well as the demise of the Republic itself. For instance, as the sun sets on the Republic, Anakin contemplates a turn toward the dark side in order to rescue Padme from a certain death. What may have seemed like a benign choice of lighting during Anakin's rescue of his mother back in Attack of the Clones is made more potent as the fates of Anakin and the Republic are decided in this fateful moment. This visual motif is also repeated during Yoda and Obi-Wan's breach of the Jedi Temple, where a moment of chiaroscuro further highlights Anakin's downfall and the somber demise of the Republic. Anakin's march on the Jedi Temple at nightfall earlier in the film also acts as a rather eye-catching example of this technique. However, for me, the most notable instance of chiaroscuro happens earlier in the film, inside Yoda's study. This notable Venetian blinds effect was also featured in Attack of the Clones, where Yoda admits that he's unable to see through the fog of Palpatine's machinations. Here, Anakin and Yoda convene over the nature of his recent premonitions, which, as we know, is a concept that plays an important mythic role across all 3 trilogies. The obscuring nature of Venetian blinds themselves makes for an apt metaphor of the obstructed view onto future events, as well as the blinding nature of hubris that ensnares the Jedi Council in this trilogy. As Lottie Eisner might put it, what would have otherwise been an incidental moment of realism is instead used to reveal a deeper truth. In creating a trend toward lighting complexity across each film, the prequels follow a similar pattern to the original trilogy. With the sequel trilogy, we return to multiple directors, and thus multiple sensibilities around lighting. What's interesting is, despite the narrative similarities between The Force Awakens and A New Hope, the lighting between the 2 films couldn't be any more different. The Force Awakens takes full advantage of its sets in creating its lighting design, and there's plenty of chiaroscuro worth mentioning here. There's Lor San Tekka, silhouetted by a burning village, a helpless bystander spotlighted by the blaster rifle of a stormtrooper, the mysterious stimming emanating throughout the wreckage of a Star Destroyer, the ominously lit chamber where Poe is interrogated by Kylo Ren, and that's just in the first 30 minutes. Mood and naturalism are the key factors driving most of these lighting setups, but there are some interesting symbolic uses as well. The most notable example occurs during the bridge sequence near the end of the film. After the Starkiller base drains the sun's energy completely, Kylo and his father are left in the shadows of the dim red lighting of the base's interior. This highlights the very moment that Kylo makes his committed turn toward the dark side. What's perhaps less emphasized and yet equally interesting about this scene is that after touching his son's face one last time, Han notably falls into a pool of white light, rather than into complete darkness. In my opinion, this reflects Han's unfailing love for his son Ben, and perhaps even foreshadows the effect that love would have on Ben's character arc in the final film of this trilogy. Another noteworthy example occurs just moments later, during Kylo and Rey's lightsaber duel. Much like the chiaroscuro that was used to highlight Luke's unconscious fears in the cave on Dagobah, the flashes of red and blue lighting across Rey's face in her duel with Kylo suggests a similar balance of light and darkness in her character. It's worth mentioning that she appears to choose the dark side rather than the light in this moment of serenity, accessing the same latent anger that Luke channels in both Empire and Return of the Jedi. Moving on to Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, we see a somewhat greater emphasis on chiaroscuro via natural light. There's the otherworldly glare hanging over the Unity Tree, which then makes way for the single ray of light that pierces its interior. As Luke recalls the failures of the Jedi, a cascading sunset pours into the first Jedi Temple, invoking the events of failure from Revenge of the Sith. There's over a half dozen silhouettes throughout this film, some of which highlight a loss of hope, while others mark its return. And you can't talk about The Last Jedi without bringing up the infamous ramming of the Supremacy. Just as each character's story comes to its logical breaking point, the ship splits in two, along with the film's exposure. Much like The Force Awakens before it, naturalism, mood, and symbolism are The Last Jedi's main motivators when utilizing chiaroscuro. Finally, JJ returns with the last film in the saga, The Rise of Skywalker. This entire film feels like the fever dream of a 12-year-old, and yet, when juxtaposed with the ideals of German Expressionism, that's what makes this final film so interesting. More than any Star Wars film before it, Rise abandons all sense of George's conceptions of an immaculate reality in favor of generating these strange and otherworldly visions of a faraway galaxy. Not unlike the dark side itself, these visions are pathways to a seemingly unnatural world. There's the burnt tree lines of Mustafar, where Kylo finds the Wayfinder, the red honeycomb zone that gates the unknown regions, and even the otherworldly planets visited during the lightspeed skipping sequence. Has Star Wars ever been quite so uncanny? These unnatural visions of a once familiar galaxy are perhaps best realized on the planet Exegol, which seems to fully expose the strange essence lying beneath the surface of this film. There's the endless rows of Star Destroyers that hang above its surface, the Valhallan-like halls of the Sith Citadel which exist just below, a vat of Snokes maintained by Sith cultists, and most unnatural of all, the ghoulish visage of the Emperor carried on a mechanical spine. These are visions truly ripped from the pages of the German Expressionists themselves, and in service of these unreal images is the element of chiaroscuro, which generates its heap of metaphysical unease throughout. Of course, there are scenes grounded in natural light for much of the film, but the heart of Rise's visual style owes so much to the morbid creativity of the German Expressionists. Disregarding films like The Lighthouse or Joel Coen's adaptation of Macbeth, this is German Expressionism made modern in the most visually extravagant sense. So with each film's use of chiaroscuro explored, what can we say are the key takeaways for this lighting technique within Star Wars? Like many other films, the chiaroscuro of Star Wars is used to generate mood, symbolism, naturalism, and even at times pure abstraction. It would also appear that in all three trilogies, as the hero's journey grows darker and more perilous, the film's lighting follows suit. This is what I would call the practical narrative reasons for why chiaroscuro is utilized within Star Wars, and is evidenced in other film series, such as in the darker imagery of the later Harry Potter films. However, there's something particularly compelling about the chiaroscuro of Star Wars in comparison. Because Star Wars deals in mythic storytelling, its chiaroscuro often highlights narrative elements that are striking at something much more eternal. This imbues the imagery of Star Wars with a potent aura that, in my opinion, has played a direct role in its status as society's de facto modern myth. While the immaculate realism of its imagery has made Star Wars magical, the revelations of its chiaroscuro is arguably what's made it eternal. And that wraps up our exploration of chiaroscuro throughout the Skywalker Saga. If you like this video, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more Star Wars and film theory breakdowns. If you have a favorite moment of Chiaroscuro from Star Wars, share it in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you here on the next one.